we simplified radicals, then we added or subtracted, and this is multiply and divide. There's only 4 sections in this chapter. So we'll be testing again shortly because this is the 3rd section. So probably the middle of next week we'll have a test. Alright. Let's do a couple of examples here. Alright, so when I multiply radicals, how do I do it? What do I do? Yes. So you multiply the numbers outside times each other. So the 2 and the 5, and that would be 10. And then you multiply what's under the radical times each other. So 3 times 6 would be 18. After you've multiplied, you need to then look at your answer. Because if it'll simplify, you should simplify it. So can radical 18 simplify? Yes. So I could make it 9 and 2. So square root of 9 is 3. So it simplifies to 30 radical 2. Alright, so you guys try this one then. So I have 2 radical 5 times 9 radical 7. So multiply those together and then see if it needs to be simplified. What'd you get for that one? Thank you. 18 radical 35. And radical 35 didn't simplify, so that was all you had to do there. So if it'll simplify, you should simplify it. If not, then you're done. So you'll have some where you're just multiplying 2 radical expressions together like that. Okay, so then it'll move on and have you distribute. I feel like it's easier to go ahead and multiply them together before you start trying to simplify, and then you only have to simplify it once at the end. All right, so if I distribute the radical 6, what's radical 6 times 2 radical 3? 2 radical 18 minus, and then what's radical 6 times radical 18? Okay. Then you should simplify. So I know radical 18, we just did that one, is 9 and 2. So I take the square root of 9, which is 3, and multiply that by the 2. So that would be 6 radical 2. All right, what about radical 108? What's the largest perfect square that goes into that? What was that? 9 and 12. So then 36. Does 36 go in? All right, so 36 and 3. And so that would be 6 radical 3. Okay. Can I add those together? No. The radicals aren't the same, so I have to leave it like that. How do you do one of those? This is one off your worksheet. Number 10. So I have 2 radical 2 times 7 radical 6 plus 9 radical 14. So distribute the 2 radical 2 and then see if it will simplify. What'd you guys get for that?
28 radical 3 plus 36 radical 7.
Good. 28 radical 3 plus 36 radical 7. So when you distribute it here, you got 14 radical 12. And then here, 18 radical 28. Which both of those is simplified. 12 is 4 and 3. So the square root of 4 is 2. That gives you your 28 radical 3. And this is 4 and 7. So that would be 36 radical 7. Alright, so any questions on that so far? Okay. Next. Alright, let's talk about dividing. Alright, so if I have 2 divided by radical 5, what's the problem with that? Can you have a radical in the denominator? No. Do you remember how to get rid of it? Good, so I multiply the top and the bottom by radical 5. So I end up with 2 radical 5. And what's radical 5 times radical 5? 5. Alright, so when you multiply a number times a radical, you just put the number in front of the radical. So it'd have 2 radical 5 over 5. Okay. Alright, so what about on this one? What am I going to multiply by top and bottom? Radical 10. So on top, what's radical 3 times radical 10? Radical 30. And on bottom, 10. Will that simplify any further? No. Nothing goes into 30. That would let me simplify it. Okay. So you'll have a few like that. And then the last section, well, the second to the last section, it says identify the conjugate. I don't know if you guys remember what that is. Alright, so it's going to give you some, this is 19 in your book, and once you don't have to do anything with it, you just have to identify what the conjugate is. Alright, so when you have the conjugate, because we're going to use it here in a minute, all you do, you don't change anything but the operation between the two numbers. So if you're given 3 minus radical 3, the conjugate to that would be 3 plus radical 3. So I just changed the operation between the real number here, well, between that number and the radical. So you have 4 of those where you're just giving the conjugate. And then on the back page, you have to divide. And when we divide with something like that in the denominator, that's when we use the conjugate. So this is 23. So when we had just a radical down there, we multiplied top and bottom by radical 3. But when you have an expression like this, you can't just do the radical. You have to do the conjugate. All right, so you have to multiply top and bottom by the conjugate. It's the only way to simplify that. So the conjugate here is, we already said 3 plus radical 3. Alright, so on bottom, because I have 2 things times 2 things, what do I have to do with those? FOIL them? Alright, so if I FOIL these together, I take first times first, so it's 3 times 3. 9. And then outer, what's 3 times radical 3? 3 radical 3. And then what's inner is 3 times the negative radical 3. And then last, you take negative radical 3 times the positive radical 3. What is that? Negative radical 3 times the positive radical 3. So it'd be negative 3 because it comes out of the radical. All right. So what happens to these two terms in the middle? They cancel out. That's what the conjugate, changing this sign here, that's what its purpose is. Because if you have the same thing with different signs, these two middle terms will always cancel, which they're the ones that would have a radical. And so that gets rid of our radical on bottom. So what's 9 minus 3 then? 6. Okay, so my denominator is now a 6. And then on top, you just have to distribute. So if I distribute 5 to both of these, what do I get?
15 plus 5.
Alright, so then you should look if these three numbers, the 15, the 5, and the 6, if they all had a common factor, then we would have to divide them all by that. But they don't because of this 5 here. So that is your final answer. Okay. Let's do another one of those. So if I have 6 divided by 2 plus radical 3, what am I going to multiply by top and bottom? Yes, the conjugate, which is 2 minus radical 3. Okay, so since I know that the middle two terms of FOIL are going to cancel, then all I have to do really is the first and the last. I don't have to do the outer and the inner part because they're going to cancel every time. So what's 2 times 2? And what's positive radical 3 times the negative radical 3? Negative 3. Alright, so on bottom I would have 4 minus 3, which is 1. Which if it's a denominator of 1, I don't really have to put it. And then on top I would distribute, so what would that be? 12 minus 6 radical 3. That would be your answer. Okay, let's have you do one off the worksheet. And then alright, so 26, you guys try this one on your own. It's 9 divided by 5 minus radical 10. So multiply top and bottom by the conjugate. you guys get for that one? Okay. So you multiply by 5 plus radical 10. I think that'll simplify. So on top you would have 45 plus 9 radical 10. Or maybe it won't. Let me see. And then on bottom, if you do first, you'd have 25. And then minus 10, which would be 15. Do all three of these numbers have a common factor? 3. So you should divide them all by 3, which should give you 15 plus 3 radical 10 all over 5. Okay, so that should be your final answer there. Alright, so you're doing 1 through 26 on that worksheet.